former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's son Alex reveals that he was approached by Chinese spies relating to a project that involved a Labor MP. We're also going to talk about the unhinged social media stars who've been recruited to warn young people about the dangers of vaping. You're not going to believe some of the content they've posted online, and now they're being paid by the taxpayer. Yet another absurd decision. Also, the media prepares to fight the extraordinary suppression orders surrounding a woman charged with alleged kidnapping and torture of a man who worked for a Jewish company. I spoke about this on the show last night. Now we're fighting to lift those suppression orders, and the lawyer leading the charge, Justin Quill, is going to join me. But first tonight, why Penny Wong, Mark Dreyfus and Anthony Albanese are barely saying a word about the major security threats to Australia as outlined by our top spy last night. ASIO head Mike Burgess has revealed Islamic terror is the leading terror threat we face, yet inside sources claim, and they've told me this, that his influence, along with that of the Office of National Intelligence Director General Andrew Shearer, have been diminishing under the Albanese government. Penny Wong instead has become a leading and highly influential voice on national security. While the Labor government has been seriously downplaying the anti-Semitism we're seeing very clearly every day on our streets, Mike Burgess says it's one of the most serious risks.
Sunni violent extremism poses the greatest religiously motivated extremist threat in Australia. ASIO remains concerned, though, about lone actors, the potential for an individual or small group under the radar of authorities to use readily available weapons to carry out an act of terrorism. And this is a concern across the spectrum of motivations, religious and ideological.
And look, we have to say the threat of terror is something that we've been skirting around. I really haven't wanted to speak about it because it's just too awful to even contemplate. But Mike Burgess last night saying that it's really, sadly, a realistic possibility.
All this means there is a realistic possibility, a terrorist attack or attack planning in the next 12 months. Possible does not mean negligible. ASIO is currently investigating multiple individuals who have discussed conducting terrorism in Australia. If you believe a person is going down a dark extremist path, please talk to someone about it and consider calling the National Security Hotline.
And he also spoke about the violence that we've already seen and the protests against Jews.
We've seen heightened community tensions that have translated to some incidents of violence connected to protest activity. We've also observed increased rhetoric encouraging violence in response to the conflict. Hateful rhetoric has targeted Israel and the Jewish community, as well as the Muslim and Palestinian communities.
So we now know very clearly from the head of ASIO the main threats to our security and our way of life. Islamic terror, but also foreign interference and espionage, a significant concern. He says it's a certainty. So radical Islamic terror and China, according to ASIO, are Australia's two greatest threats. Yet this is very different from what Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill and others have been speaking about publicly. I mean, you've barely heard a critical word from Albanese, Wong, or even Richard Marles about China, and certainly extremely little about Chinese foreign interference and espionage. Instead, the government's been pursuing a cosier relationship with China, with Albanese even failing to raise the case of the injured Australian Navy SEALs with President Xi when he saw him just days later. Instead, as you can see, it was a chummy embrace. No mention that a Chinese warship had just targeted and injured our divers at sea. Albanese didn't have the courage to confront the Chinese president about it, and you need courage when you're the PM. And then when it comes to the threat of Islamic terror, the greatest extremist threat to Australia, we know that now, nothing from the government either. Labor prefers to speak about right-wing extremism.
We see big groups of people who are still on a religious fundamentalism pathway, but now a very large group of people who are of interest, who subscribe to various forms of right-wing kind of nationalism, Nazism, those sorts of things, and it's obviously enormously concerning.
It's very rare to hear a Labor minister speak about Islamic terror, despite the very clear advice that they're getting from their security agencies. Penny Wong, who, as you know, comes from Labor's left faction, has indicated also that she's keen to restart funding to UNRWA, saying that it's an important vehicle for our aid, despite its clear terror links.
We obviously have previously increased our funding for UNRWA, and we are keen to work with both the organisation and with Japan and other like-mindeds who have paused funding to work out how we can gain the confidence to restore funding, and we'll continue to do that work.
It's not going to be long before it starts flowing again. Already $200 million to UNRWA since 2010. Now, you just have to think back to how former coalition leaders spoke about both China and the threat of terrorism in the years past. They made it very clear, and Australians always knew what our national security concerns were. They didn't shy away from calling out terrorism or introducing new laws where necessary to protect Australians. Now, there's a sense from those connected to the national security community that Andrew Shearer and ASIO's Mike Burgess have had less influence in the Albanese government than they did during the coalition era. And I'm told that Penny Wong has been the utterly dominant voice in the National Security Committee of Cabinet. Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security Deputy Chair Andrew Wallace told me today that this government thinks it can solve the problems of the world through DFAT, but the reality is it can't. Now, you have to ask, after the assessment that we heard from ASIO last night, are the senior government leadership listening to their security heads? Burgess's security assessment should be encouraging Australia to enhance its relationship with countries like Israel that hold intelligence that could help ensure that the worst scenario Burgess outlined doesn't happen. And you heard Mike Burgess say he's not ruling out the possibility of a Sunni terror attack, and Israel is the one country with the best intelligence in this area. It's already prevented in years gone past a terror attack in Australia. Yet the Albanese government has been alienating Israel even before the October 7 attacks. And the reality is that being tough on China and terrorism doesn't suit Labor politically or ideologically. Labor has Muslim constituencies in Western Sydney seats, and they think that part of the reason they won the last federal election was because of Chinese-dominated seats, because Labor took a softer position than the coalition on the threat from China. Those seats are Aston, Reid, Bennelong and Chisholm. But it does matter that ministers aren't speaking plainly and clearly about the gravest threats to our nation, and that they're also not developing tougher laws to address these threats. All right, let's bring in now our Thursday panel. Sky News host Danica Di Giorgio. Great to see you,
Likewise,
Danica.
Sharri.
And in Perth this evening, commentator Jason Morrison. Welcome, Jason. Look, Jason, I want to start with you about that. Mike Burgess very clear on the two gravest threats Australia faces, China and Islamic terror, and yet you barely hear them on Labor government agenda.
Well, you've kind of nailed it in many respects. It's quite convenient politically to be able to imply that the threat is coming from the right, so that any time Peter Dutton or any leading light in the Liberal National Party speaks out and says something that's quite conservative, which, by the way, many of their voters support, you can straight away say, oh, they're over there with the lunatics. They would have you believe that the big threat in Australia are the Catholics, the hardline Catholics, or the Protestants that believe deeply in the King George or whatever it happens to be. And it's just bull. And, the issue, and it's often tied, and it's tied back to 2019 when we had that atrocity that happened in New Zealand with that guy and his connections and his allegiances and whatever else. And so that has become a convenient if you want, position to be able to say, that's the real threat. Look how horrific that was in a nation just like ours. But indeed, it looks straight past that. To date, the people arrested overwhelmingly in connection with allegations and convictions of terrorism and plots to commit it have been from the Islamic corner. And that's an undeniable situation, and I don't know why we keep denying it.
What do you think about this? Because last night, Mike Burgess's comments would have come as a surprise to many Australians, because it's just not what the government's been saying.
No, well, I mean, this was the first time we really heard about it, and I think it's a problem when you've got Mike Burgess, who is a very well-respected person, very at the top of his game, saying that, quote, there is a realistic possibility of a terrorist attack in this country within the next 12 months. Possibility is the key word here, but they do a very good job. And if the heads of the national security agencies, as you've just reported, Sharri, have had less influence in the Albanese government than in previous governments, well, the question needs to be asked, why? And why is Penny Wong being given so much power on this issue? What credentials does she have to be able to have a say on this compared to somebody like Mike Burgess? I worry, though, about the people we are letting in this country and the vetting system that we've got going on. We know that 2,000 visas, for example, were granted to people in Gaza, and it took 1 hour, Sharri, as we know, to vet these people. And you reported last week that you had a whole list, and some of them hadn't been vetted correctly. But look, there is a political motive on this. He knows, Anthony Albanese knows, that he's already losing votes in Western Sydney, southwestern Sydney, particularly because they're the ones that are doing it tough in this cost of living crisis. He knows he doesn't want to upset them, so he's turning a blind eye to it, but also doesn't want to alienate the Chinese vote. You spoke about Bennelong, for example. More than half of its residents are born overseas, the majority of them from China. He doesn't want to alienate his base. And the question needs to be asked, at what price?
No, absolutely. Now, we're going to come back to this story a bit later. I've got Peter Jennings on the show, and he has a lot to say about what's going on behind the scenes here. So stay tuned for that. But let's turn now to Dunkley. There's a by-election, as we know, just 2 days' time on Saturday. Now, former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, along with Jewish leaders, are saying that Labor shouldn't be preferencing the Greens in Dunkley because they're now an openly anti-Semitic party. As we've reported, one anti-Semitic Greens politician, Jenny Leong, claimed that Jews have their tentacles everywhere. And then Alexander Downer wrote in the Fin that the Labor Party had claimed the Liberals would be morally compromised if it didn't put One Nation last on its how to vote cards. He says, let's apply the same standard to the Greens. Labor will be deeply morally compromised unless it puts the Greens last on its how to vote cards. Jason, Alexander Downer has a very good point here.
Yeah, he does. Although, out of interest, just prior to coming on, I thought I'd have a look at the Greens how to vote card. The nutcase from the Greens has put the Liberal Party 1 ahead of Labor, so the Liberals are 6 or 7 and Labor's 6. So, it's a technicality really in how to vote cards. I actually quite enjoy the fact that we are really seeing the Greens for what they are at the moment. And I think it's important for a lot of people, and, there's a lot of people that sort of, linger over there thinking that, they are for the better good and whatever else, seeing that there's a whole lot of Jew haters inside the Greens party. I don't know about the candidate down there. I've spent about that much time studying what he's had to say because I know he won't get there. His influence will be substantial, though, because tonight, it is reported in the new Channel 7 owned nightly newspaper that it's too close to call in this Dunkley by-election. And they've got an opinion poll out that essentially puts it at almost, 50-50 with a whole lot of undecided voters. Now, undecided voters can go anywhere. They can also go donkey, and they can also not show up. If they go donkey, the Liberal Party will benefit from that because they're at the top of the ticket. They could be, favouring Labor at the very bottom of the ticket. But the Greens' influence on this one will be profound, and it's unavoidable, unfortunately. People who think Labor and won't vote Labor often vote Greens. It doesn't really matter what's on the card.
Yeah. Look, question time today, Danica, was dominated by the news that has now turned out to be utterly incorrect, that another one of the released criminal detainees had reoffended. Question time was absolute mayhem. It was so bad for the government that Albanese just ended question time after 1 hour. It was the shortest question time of the year, according to Sky's political editor, Andrew Clennell. Just have a look at how bad it was for Labor.
Must reinforce at all times community safety is our first priority. As soon as we became aware of this issue, we have rectified it. On this occasion, with further evidence, it is clear the person arrested is not the offender, and for that we are sincerely sorry that this person has been detained. I wouldn't say it was a blunder. The investigators had sufficient information to make the arrest. They've made the arrest. They've conducted an interview. Based on the evidence they had sufficient to charge that person at the time.
We'll bring you the comments from question time in a bit, but that was Victorian Police. They held a press conference just this evening admitting that they completely got it wrong. I mean, this is extraordinary, Danica. You know, they initially charged someone, then they've had to come out and say that it was a case of mistaken identity. Meanwhile, Labor had a shocking end to the week, and it's going to put them on the back foot.
Of course.
With Dunkley.
Absolutely. I mean, 1 hour question time. Nothing to see here. Wipe our hands, walk away. Just an absolute shocker. Firstly, as for Victoria Police, that's a huge bungle, and I'm sure there'll be a full investigation as to what's gone wrong. But Anthony Albanese wouldn't be happy about the events anyway, because we've had about 5 hours of people talking about it throughout the entire day. There's been rolling coverage on news outlets about this a detainee that was charged, which didn't end up actually being the case. But it would still have an impact, that's for sure. And if you look at a poll that was published in the AFR last week, it found that immigration and border security are top of minds in places like Dunkley. So I still think it is going to have an impact. But look, regardless, it's not going to erase the issues of border security and immigration. Once again, Andrew Giles this week still cannot answer basic questions.
Well, we've got those comments now, so let's have a look at how under pressure Andrew Giles was today.
When was the Minister first informed that a serial sex offender the Albanese government released from immigration detention had been charged with sexual assault, stalking and 2 counts of unlawful assault in Victoria?
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for her question. I was informed of the arrest last evening through appropriate law enforcement channels.
Out of the 149 hardcore criminals released by the Albanese government, how many rapists and sex offenders have reoffended since being released?
As I've said previously to the House, where individuals offend or breach their visa conditions, they will face the consequences. They will face those consequences which are a matter for state or Commonwealth law enforcement agencies.
Jason, do you think that this is going to have an impact on the by-election, even though the information was false? Do you think the damage has already been done and people in Victoria are going to think, oh, yep, another sex offender who Labor released has reoffended, even though it's just a complete stuff-up by the incompetent Victorian police?
It all feels a bit like noise at the moment. The jury went out a long time ago on this issue, probably before Christmas, when Australians got the feeling that the government wasn't handling this very well at all. So I kind of think as an issue, it's just part of the mess that will be in people's minds about how well the country is being run and administered at the moment. I mean, I've got to say, everywhere I've gone today, and I'm in Perth, and, all over Perth radio. We're talking from the AM band to the FM band to social media to news articles. All people are talking about is which Polly sold Australia out to the Commos. Who did it? Who was the treacherous so-and-so that did it? That's what people are talking about. And, unfortunately, this issue about the release of offenders and whatever else, look, it's happened. People have made their mind up a long time ago about how badly that's been handled. But this is the issue. Australians are burning and angry about it right now. And they really have got no answers at all from the government. They've got no answers at all. They've got innuendo. And the sad thing is, most Aussies, whether they're into politics or not, can probably name 3 or 4 people that they have a gut feel are probably involved in it, which is quite tragic for the country in a way. And by the way, they're not all from the Labor Party side.
Yeah. Look, and I'm going to talk about that big story throughout the show with Peter Jennings, also with Basil Zemplis and Matt Canavan a bit later. But before we get onto that, Danica, we've heard some more really sad details about the murders of Jessie Baird and Luke Davies today. Reports on Channel 7, also in the Daily Mail, that their flatmates actually slept in the house. They thought that blood seeping through were beetroot stains. This is devastating that they still slept in the house on the night after they were allegedly murdered and didn't, know that their bodies were there.
It's look, Sharri, it's another tragic detail to what is already such a tragic case, and your heart goes out to the victims' families and friends. I mean, they're never going to be able to recover from that. It's plain and simple. Look, this case has really captivated Sydney, and I think that even if you didn't know the two men involved, you can't help but follow along with just how awful it's been. Your heart just goes out to everybody involved. I mean, It's just terrible.
There's going to be a family vigil tomorrow afternoon for them. Danica, Jason, thank you both so much for joining me, as always, on a Thursday. Now, after the break, our fight begins to tell you more about the woman charged with alleged kidnapping and torture of a man because he works for a Jewish company. The lawyer leading this battle will join me after the break. Plus, Peter Jennings will be on to discuss why the Albanese government doesn't want to talk about the most obvious threats to our national security. Stay tuned. We'll be back. Welcome back. Well, now to the onerous suppression order that was rushed through the courts yesterday to keep secret the identity of a Melbourne woman charged with alleged kidnapping and torture. So this woman charged with serious offences, alleged kidnapping and torture, and yet we can't name her, we can't show you her photograph, tell you which community she's part of, which organisation she works for, or even the work that she does. I revealed last night that members of the Jewish community had alerted authorities about her, but nothing had been done. I've also previously reported that she's a terrorist sympathiser and she spread Hamas propaganda online. Now, this case is clearly in the public interest, and yet there's no transparency of the justice system. The open courts in Victoria require that the media gets notice of applications for suppression orders, but that never happened. So this effectively all unfolded in secret. There were no submissions made against her suppression, against her details being kept secret. Now, Justin Quill is a partner at the major law firm Thompson Gear, and he joins me now. Justin, thank you so much for your time. Now, how normal is it to have this level of secrecy around an alleged kidnapping and torture case?
Well, it shouldn't be normal at all. Unfortunately, in Victoria, it's more normal than in any other state, and it's concerningly normal. Look, the Open Courts Act, sometimes I think it's the ironically named Open Courts Act, requires that all proceedings in Victoria be heard in open court. And only in very rare, very extreme circumstances and for very good reason can they be closed. And what's worse, as you pointed out in your introduction, Sharri, there is a requirement, a regime for the media to be notified of suppression orders. The court's supposed to be given 3 days' notice by the party applying, and then the court is supposed to inform the media, and neither of those things happened in this case. So it's not normal, but it is happening too often in Victoria.
So the usual process wasn't followed. Those 3 days' notice, it wasn't given. Have the media outlets, have you been given any justification for this extreme secrecy and the fact that usual process wasn't followed?
No. Look, I can say this. The first suppression order made last Friday was made in an out-of-sessions bail hearing. Now, these out-of-sessions hearings in the bail court are often heard effectively in police stations, and out of hours, as the name suggests. So that's perhaps not unusual. Not unusual for the media not to be notified. It's all very urgent. Perhaps there's been an arrest and someone's applying for bail immediately. I don't have a great issue with that. I can live with that. But what I'm concerned about, and where in my view, the circus really started, is that then the media started reporting on this matter earlier in the week. And because of that media reporting, in particular the Herald Sun's front page, an application was made to vary the order. So the court and the parties were on notice that the media were interested in it, and they were seeking an order that was going to impact the media, and yet the media weren't informed of it. It's pretty concerning turn of events with the variation hearing heard on Wednesday afternoon. No notice being given to the media. That's concerning to me.
Justin, as you mentioned, this was a front page in the Herald Sun. It was a great exclusive that they had. This story is very concerning. It's in the public interest. I spoke about it last night at length. The Herald Sun editor, Sam Weir, made it clear in the paper today that he intends to fight this. Sky News is going to join that fight. You're organising this. Can you tell us a bit about what you plan to do?
Yes, well, there's a whole stack of media organisations joining, as you say, Sky News, the Herald Sun, the Australian, 9, 7, Rebel News. There's a whole stack of media organisations who want to join the fight for the public's right to know. Look, we'll be asking for an expedited hearing. When this order was made on Friday and then again varied on Wednesday, it was made on an interim basis. Now, the Open Courts Act, as I say, the ironically named Open Courts Act, requires that interim orders are dealt with urgently. So you can make an order overnight or perhaps for a few hours or maybe a few days. And that's what normally happens. If an interim order is made, there's a hearing set for a few days' time or maybe the next day, or perhaps sometimes it's made in the morning and dealt with in the afternoon. In this case, the next hearing of this suppression order is set for May 31, more than 3 months after the making of the interim order. Now, our position will be that that is totally unacceptable and that we will be asking for an expedited hearing of this matter so we can put submissions to the magistrate. Submissions, I might say, that the magistrate unfortunately didn't have the benefit. So the magistrate's been put in a difficult position because she didn't have the benefit of submissions from the media as to why this suppression order should not be made.
Yeah, well, Justin Quill, thank you so much for coming on tonight, but also for leading this fight for press freedom once again. You've done it too many times. We shouldn't have to fight for it all the time. The courts should be open, and it does appear that there's a particular problem in Victoria. Justin Quill, thank you very much. Let's bring in now to talk about our top story tonight, the terror threats, as outlined last night by the ASIO boss Mike Burgess, and why this agenda appears to be so different from the Albanese government. Let's bring in Strategic Analysis Australia Director Peter Jennings. Peter, welcome to the show. Look, I spoke at the start of this program, the start of the hour, about how last night ASIO boss Mike Burgess clearly said that the threat from China, espionage and foreign interference is a certainty. He said that in terms of terror threats, it's Islamic terror that poses the greatest risk to Australia. Yet you never hear any Albanese government ministers speaking about this. It doesn't appear to be on their agenda. What do you think about this?
Well, good evening, Sharri. It's curious, isn't it? And of course, Mike Burgess is a public servant and official. What makes him a little different, I think, from many of his cohort is that he has his own act, the ASIO Act, which makes him responsible for making a number of these key intelligence determinations. And he's also a person of, pretty independent mind. And I think, thank goodness that Mike has created a process whereby at least once a year he gives a speech which sets out a security assessment. Why is the government not talking about these things? Well, on China, it's because they are pretending that we have a stabilised relationship, the thing that enabled some elements of trade to resume and which allowed Anthony Albanese to go following the footsteps of Gough Whitlam 50 years after his visit to Beijing. But the truth of the matter is, in terms of cyber hacking, counter-intelligence, China is aggressively moving against Australia and plans to dominate the Indo-Pacific region. The government simply doesn't want to talk about this because it cuts across its narrative of we have stabilised the relationship with China. And on the terrorism front, I think the reason is quite simply that really from the outrageous Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October last year, too much of the government's attention was focused on how do we sort of soften this message so as not to offend Muslim Australians who our government believes votes for them. And so they talk in the softest possible terms. They can never mention anti-Semitism separately from also talking about anti-Islamicism, although frankly I don't see much of that in the Australian community these days. It's all about softening a domestic political message. And it's a good thing that Mike Burgess is there to actually remind us that terrorism continues to be a problem and that we are, frankly, right now, in the fight of our lives in dealing with an aggressive China, which is engaging in spying on Australia 24/7.
Look, it's so concerning, and I agree with you, and I made the same points earlier in the night that the government's political reasons, its political motivations are part of the reason it hasn't been so vocal about the terror threat. But Peter, do you think it's curious that the terror threat in Australia was lowered in November 2022, and yet here we have last night Mike Burgess speaking very clearly that there is a significant or a realistic, I think his term was, realistic possibility of an Islamic terror attack, and yet the threat hasn't been raised. We know the threat is higher than it was because there's been a 600 or 700% jump in anti-Semitic incidents, both physical, both violent, and death threats. Yet no terror threat has been raised. What do you think's gone on here?
So, Sharri, there was a case in late 2022 to lower the threat warning, and that was after several years of, frankly, a lack of domestic terrorism incidents. What I think is really passing strange in the current circumstance was that after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023, the threat level wasn't raised, even though we began to see the most alarming, violent, extremely aggressive, extremely anti-protests taking place almost from within 24 hours of the Hamas attack. As of course we all know, on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, but then weekly, frankly, thereafter in Sydney and Melbourne and in a number of other Australian capital cities. Match that with, as you say, the appalling level of threats which have been made against Jewish Australians, the extremely violent and aggressive information which is put forward on social media by proponents of the Palestinian cause, that is to say extremist proponents of the Palestinian cause and people who really don't bother to hide their support for Hamas, a terrorist organisation. Why did our officials and our government not think about lifting the terrorist threat level at that time? Again, I think the answer to that goes back to the government's domestic political view, which is let's keep this soft for an important constituency that tend to vote Labor. If you read Mike Burgess's speech carefully, he's really saying, look, don't worry too much about the threat level. Understand that terrorism is now a live problem, a persistent problem here in Australia. And frankly, he is, I think, the only person I have heard say that clearly, apart from you and I and a few commentators, Sharri, since October 7 of last year.
So you kind of have to read between the lines of his speech to say to potentially he might not be agreeing with the threat level, and he might be telling us, ignore the threat level, this is a real threat. And it's terrifying.
I think you can read that in the speech.
Yeah. Peter Jennings, you've been involved in the national security space for a long time. Really appreciate you coming on the program tonight. Now, coming up, guessing games ramp up over who is the traitorous former politician that was called out by Australia's top spy. Malcolm Turnbull's son reveals that he was approached by Chinese spies. We're going to discuss that in a minute. Plus, the crude, rude and vile social media influencers who've been recruited by Labor, all at taxpayer expense. Okay, let's return to this major story that's had everyone talking today, that former spies convinced one former politician to betray Australia. And then they came up with a plot to target a relative of a Prime Minister. The boss of ASIO made that stunning revelation last night.
Several years ago, the A-Team successfully cultivated and recruited a former Australian politician. This politician sold out their country, party, former colleagues to advance the interests of a foreign regime. At one point, the former politician even proposed bringing a Prime Minister's family member into the spy's orbit. Fortunately, that plot did not go ahead, but others did.
Well, there was criticism today that Mike Burgess made this revelation public, but then didn't name anyone specifically.
You cannot have the head of our national security organisation go public with allegations against or statements of fact against a politician and then not have the guts to name who that person was. A rap on the knuckles from the head of ASIO is not appropriate, and it's not enough for someone who was a traitor to Australia.
I think it is unfair on a lot of former MPs who are patriotic, as 99.9% on both sides are, and if there's one that they've identified who's not, then frankly that person should be outed and shamed.
And that was Peter Dutton speaking to Ray Hadley today. So who is the MP said to have been compromised by a foreign power? Well, we don't know, but the list of MPs that have had regular dealings with foreign governments is extensive. And Sam Dastyari, who left politics over his links to China, came out today in an interview with Christopher Daw to say he had nothing to do with the spy scandal. And then so did former New South Wales Labor MP Ernest Wong. His interview with Sam Maiden. Then Alex Turnbull also told Sam Maiden that he was approached by Chinese spies. He says he did the right thing and that he reported the approach immediately to authorities. Alex Turnbull told Sam Maiden, "It was just so brazen. My reaction was to express no interest and forward the details immediately to the authorities." Absolutely fascinating story, and good on Sam Maiden for being the only journalist in the country to get that out of Alex Turnbull. Let's bring in now Perth Mayor Basil Zemplis and National Senator Matt Canavan. Great to see both of you. Look, Matt, what's your view on this? Clearly, Joe Hockey, Peter Dutton, Alexander Downer and others were very critical of the fact that Mike Burgess made these comments publicly last night but didn't detail who it was. There's been criticism that it puts a lot of people under a cloud. But, does he have the right to make this public? And it would have been defamatory, even for him, had he named anyone.
Well, I think both Peter and Joe are just speaking common sense here. And on the issue that you've raised, that's why we have something called parliamentary privilege. And I think perhaps it would have been wise for Mr Burgess to make these statements to Parliament. He has that opportunity at appearances at Senate estimates, and indeed other hearings can be arranged. In fact, I'm pretty sure ASIO at least were at Senate estimates only a couple of weeks ago. I'm pretty sure Mike was there. I wasn't there, but he would normally turn up. So he has those opportunities to do that there. So I'm not sure why he didn't take those. I do think it's very unfair to former MPs to have this speculation whirling about them. I think either the claim should not have been made or it needed to be made in public and in full. And I also agree with Joe. I mean, there has to be ramifications here, surely. A slap on the wrist is simply not enough if this conduct is true.
Well, Mike Burgess was saying that the laws aren't retrospective, the foreign interference laws aren't retrospective, and that gives you an indication of timing, but it also was an indication that perhaps there aren't any penalties or punishments available to them. Basil, what do you think? There was also the criticism that people were saying, not publicly, that this just might have been an attempt by Mike Burgess to grab a headline to make his annual threat assessment, feature on all the newses. Do you think that's unfair to the spy boss?
Well, he certainly did that. So whether it's unfair or not, he absolutely achieved his aim if that's what he was working at. I think he clearly wanted to put people on notice. He wanted to put those overseas threats on notice. And he most likely wanted to put any other MPs that might be dabbling or tempted to dabble. Or, to be fair to them, maybe there's an approach, and we heard the way Alex Turnbull described it, something comes to you, you're not quite sure what it is, you might be tempted to type back and suddenly you're hooked. and you're engaged and it's hard to get away from. He went halfway, didn't he? He made the statements, he put people on notice, but then didn't name the former MP. And like just about everybody else, if I was a former MP, I would want everybody to know that it wasn't me. The only way they can do that is by letting us know who it was.
Yeah. Well, look, one thing I think is for certain, it's good that he has, to a certain extent, put out there just how aggressive China is in targeting politicians and people who have access to secret information, because no one else is telling us about this stuff at the moment. Now, let's look at this story in the Fin today. Toyota is calling on the government to slow the pace of its car emission standards. It claims that it's going to push up the cost of buying a car, and it's actually going to reduce the range of cars available. Matt Canavan, you know, Toyota claims that there are very few models that actually meet the Albanese government's new standards.
Well, Toyota's right on the facts. They're right on the facts and they're right on the figures. The US scheme, which the government continually refers to, actually reduces emission limits by less than half what the government is proposing over the next few years, and it applies a fine for breaching those limits only a third of what the government is proposing. And that's why Toyota are raising the alarm here, because when you do the sums on the government's figures, the costs of the best-selling cars in this country are going to go up by thousands of dollars, in some cases over tens of thousands of dollars. And obviously that's out of reach then to many families that are already struggling with record inflation under this Labor government.
Yeah.
I think the Labor government have gone totally off the deep end here. They don't actually know the figures, I don't think. You never really hear them talk about, like I just talked about. I think they've been given broad talking points by their department and haven't done the proper due diligence about what's actually being proposed.
Look, youth vaping has been a big issue across Australia. It's quite controversial. But now the government's recruiting social media influencers to warn young people about the dangers of vaping. One of these influencers that they've hired, who goes by the account name Hey I'm Zed, has posted some pretty rude, questionable content online. I can't even show it to you because this is a family-friendly program at 8 p.m. And, I wouldn't want any young people listening to the vile and putrid language that he happily uses online. But according to the Albanese government, this is who they've hired, and they're presumably paying taxpayer funds to promote the dangers of vaping. Basil, what do you think about this?
Well, the first thing we know is no influencer is doing it for nothing, and I doubt there's a contra arrangement here, so I think we can almost certainly assume money is changing hands. What I would say is, if you're going to use influencers who perhaps are in the demo that younger people are attracted to, you need to check their accounts, and you need to make sure that they're not using the sort of language that we wouldn't want our kids being exposed to. It's one way, it's one method, and I understand the principle of trying to get to the young kids on their level. But I tell you, the other way we could fix this problem is ban the stuff. It's no good, it causes our kids harm, and it is running away from us. Maybe that's worth trying. The easy method, just get rid of it. Get it off the shelves, get it out of sight, and crack down on the places that are selling it under the counter.
Matt, what do you think about this? Should vaping be banned?
I don't think there's any way we're going to ban it, Sharri. I mean, in Townsville, there's a vape shop right next to the cop shop. And when the local MP went in and said to the cops, "What are you doing about it?" said, "Well, mate, we've got no resources. We can't do anything about that." And that's the reality all around the country. So, Basil, it's a wonderful idea, but crime's out of control where I am in Queensland. There just aren't the resources to go and start chasing down every little shop and convenience store around the country. I mean, the reality is over 1 million people now vape. Vaping is nowhere near as damaging as smoking, and of course that's legal and available all through the country. I think we've got to face facts here and focus our efforts on the children. Like that's where we should be keeping these products out of the hands of. So we should be cracking down on the flavours, not allowing any of these candy flavours, of course, cracking down on the advertising, and most of all, taking away this income stream, which is now going to the gangs. The people selling this stuff illegally in the black market are terrible people, and they're using it to fund other crime, which we're having to deal with those scarce police resources.
Yeah.
That's the problem, though, Matt. If you get the kids hooked at this level, if they are attracted to the taste, the bubblegum flavours, all of those things, who knows where it goes from there? And so that has to be the target. We're in furious agreement. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, Basil, Matt, thank you both so much for your time. We'll see you next Thursday. Now, after the break, we're going to look at the mystery illness that has struck down Princess Kate and whether it's behind the Prince taking time off. We're going to cross live to London for the latest. Stay tuned after this quick break. Welcome back. Well, it looks like Prince Harry is going to appeal a decision that his taxpayer-funded security in the UK has been banned, and he's going to appeal that decision. He might not technically hold the title of His Royal Highness any longer, but he's still being accused by some of playing the victim. The younger son of the King Charles can't get over the fact that British taxpayers, who he dumped in favour of America, won't fund his personal security. Joining me now to discuss is royal editor for the Daily Mirror, Russell Meyer. Russell, so do you think Prince Harry is going to lodge this appeal so that his security is paid for by the taxpayer when he's in Britain? And do you think he has a fair argument or not, given he's just relinquished his royal titles?
Well, it's a good question. Good evening, Sharri. Well, I certainly think he will appeal this judgment because Prince Harry has been through sort of more twists and turns than an HBO drama with this court case. I mean, it's absolutely unprecedented taking the British government to court. He wasn't happy with the Home Office's decision to take away that taxpayer-funded security. But the argument still remains that Harry has left the royal family. He's earned tens and tens of millions of dollars in the corporate world, and he should be able to afford security for himself and his family. I mean, his argument has always been he doesn't feel safe bringing his wife and children to the UK. He feels, as a son of the king and a former member of the armed services, that he is under threat all the time. And I think the British government's point of view is that, that threat is certainly perceived by Harry and certainly possibly not in the real world a lot of the time. So I do think he will appeal it. And it'll be interesting to see whether the Court of Appeal does sort of change this judgment.
Now, the Princess of Wales has kept a very low profile since she had that abdominal surgery. The palace says that she is doing well, she's recovering well, but Prince William then cancelled an event for personal reasons earlier this week. This has led to speculation that she might not be recovering as well as it said, especially given that it was his godfather's memorial service. What are you hearing?
Well, it's certainly unfortunate, I think, for the palace and both the Princess of Wales that the rumour mill is sort of out of control at the moment. If you go onto sort of any social media site, there's an awful lot of people sort of chipping in. But what we do know is that Kensington Palace had been pretty upfront in the beginning, said that Princess Kate had gone into hospital for an abdominal surgery. She was going to be there for a couple of weeks. She was there for 2 weeks and then taking this extended period of leave at home. And that will take her right up until after Easter. So we shouldn't expect to see Kate until around about maybe mid-April when she's back to work. However, like you said, Prince William cancelling this appearance at King Constantine's memorial at Windsor Castle during the week, very, very short notice. He was due to do a reading there as well, has sort of got tongues wagging, as it were. But again, William's back at work today. He's due back. He's due in Wales tomorrow to do another engagement. So I think that things are moving along, and you never know, it could have just been one of the kids that was ill. It's up to him whether he wanted to say it was personal reasons or not, and I think everybody just needs to calm down a little bit when it comes to Kate.
Yeah, I know everyone, especially in the UK, is completely obsessed with the ins and outs of the royal family. And they do love Princess Kate and they want to make sure that she is okay. Russell Myers, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Well, thank you at home for your company this week. Loved having you with me. I'll see you on Monday at 8 o'clock. And right now, here's Paul Murray.